welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. Now, this program is being recorded early right now. It's Wednesday at midday here in Washington, Wednesday, the 29th of August. And this is because on the usual Friday, I'm going to be speaking at the Magniet Festival in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. By the time this program is broadcast, that will already be in the past, God willing. So it's a little bit earlier. We're going to devote a lot of today, again, to Bishop Romney's family tradition. Bishop Romney's family tradition, polygamy, theocracy, and hatred of the United States, which are the values of the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints, especially in its formative years, its first 3 decades, and of course, key role played by Parley Parker Pratt, the Archer of Paradise, the great-grandfather of the current, now Republican nominee, and along with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, probably in the third place in importance among the anti-American Mormons. The America haters were out there in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then in particular in Salt Lake City. And you remember when we had the big confab of the money men and the political fixers and the poobahs and windbags. At the end of June, the last weekend in June of this year, Romney called together his supportive his base, right? The haves and the have-mores, or maybe it's just the have-mores now. Maybe the haves have dropped by the wayside. Where did he have that? He's got a house out there, you know. He's got a home in Salt Lake City. Where is it located? It's someplace that's called Park City, Utah, in the Deer Valley. Park City. Well, that used to be called Parley's Park, or Parley's Park City. The place where he has his house was named after his family and his great-great-grandfather, Parley Pratt. Isn't that quaint? So we've also now had the first evening of the Republican National Convention, and we'll talk in some of the details about this. But you got to grasp the main thing. The main issue with the Republican Convention is that this is the crazed petty bourgeoisie. This is the petty bourgeoisie of small-town America, rural America, and low-wage sweatshop business people. And they are dealing with immigrant workers. They are no way around it. They're racists. They have a built-in hostility. Whenever they have to pay their taxes, they believe that black people are taking their money. They think that they're being taxed so that black people can live on welfare. Remember Ronald Reagan always telling this story, which was it was completely invented by the reactionaries of that day, about black welfare queens taking all the money. Of course, there is no more welfare. Right? What are we doing here? Romney insists on running ads about welfare. There is no welfare. The title of the Social Security Act of 1935 that provided aid to mothers with dependent children is long gone. It hasn't existed since 1996, when Bill Clinton destroyed it as part of his campaign to get reelected, his appeal to the centrists and the independents. And, of course, as we've discussed in previous broadcasts, the 50 million Americans who are now on the brink, a lot of them are there because there is no welfare. Welfare reform is not a success. Welfare reform is a failure, and it's a genocidal failure. It's killing people, even now. Some of the people you see that are homeless are people that could have been supported on welfare. Why is that important? It's important because, of course, there but for the grace of God go you, and there but for the grace of God you will go. But from the point of view of the society, what's your main asset? The main asset is always a labor force. What's your labor force? How many years of education? What's their qualification? What are their technical skills? What can they do? What are the things that they can make happen? And if you insist on throwing people on the human junk heap because of some fascist ideology off the boat from Austria, right? We used to say one Austrian is enough, but now we've got a whole bunch of Austrians, although they've taken it on the chin in the past couple of days. We'll talk about that too. The Republican Party organizes the petty bourgeoisie for the purposes of Wall Street. It's a party of Wall Street. It's the reactionary party of Wall Street. The Democratic Party, as we'll discuss in the coming broadcast, and also in an article I'm doing, the Democratic Party organizes women, minorities, blacks, Hispanics, people in cities. It organizes what's left of the organized labor movement. It organizes urban liberals for the purposes of Wall Street. But the Republican Party has to organize a different group or different groups with a different ideology. The reactionary petty bourgeoisie is the general idea. And this reactionary petty bourgeoisie, responding today as it did in Germany in the early 1930s, responding to the world economic depression by looking for scapegoats and bitterly struggling to maintain its privileges and the feeling of being ethnically challenged, right? What we've had from Pat Buchanan and all the others. Pat Buchanan, by the way, his sister is a Mormon. Bay Buchanan, the sister of Pat, changed from the Roman Catholic faith of the family to being a Latter-day Saint. Interesting process to see this, and that was done, not recently, but she indeed did show up for Romney at various times. The purpose of the Republican convention in general is to take this reactionary, crazed petty bourgeoisie and organize them around a series of demagogic slogans at the level of the United States Chamber of Commerce, or even worse, the local Chamber of Commerce. The kinds of slogans that appeal to little Babbitts, little reactionary backlash voters and activists, local boosters. And you can hear the boosterism when they call the roll call of the states. It's the kind of thing that Sinclair Lewis wrote about. And, of course, Ron Paul brought up Sinclair Lewis and the famous book, It Can't Happen Here. Poor Ron Paul, little Ron, old Ron Paul, the leprechaun, right? His swan song, leaving the historical stage, he got it wrong. The book, It Can't Happen Here, does not argue that fascism cannot occur in the United States. It argues it's an attempt to warn about the opposite, that it can happen here, it is happening here. And, of course, in order to understand that, you've got to know what fascism actually is. Now, Ron Paul thinks that it's corporatism. He thinks it's any kind of cooperation between government and industry or government and business, according to Ron Paul, is fascism. It's the fascist corporate state. Wait a minute. You cannot make that argument. There is no purely formal argument because the question of purpose always comes in human affairs. That is to say, from a formal point of view, we can say that the fascist corporate state consists of a state-sponsored compulsory cartel of labor being forced into it too, and business and government. It's tripartite. It's not just bilateral. Of course, for Ron Paul, the labor part never occurs because he wants to smash all unions. In that sense, he's not even providing a fascist union. He's not even providing a company union. He's providing no union at all. So he cannot have the classical fascist corporate state. But the purpose is what counts. And we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, coming to you a little bit earlier this week. Naturally, I hope you'll keep up with Tarpley.net. Tarpley.net, keep up with Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Some interesting tweets about Mike Leavitt up there, the former governor of Utah, who defended polygamy. He defended polygamy in 1998. It's covered by religious freedom. I'm sorry, it's not. The Republican Party of 1856 knew that slavery and polygamy were bad. That's in a certain sense the irony of this whole Republican convention. In 1856, the Republican Party included in its platform that the Republican Party, which was nominating John C. Fremont, the famous pathfinder of the West, of California, was nominated for president. In 1856, the Republican platform meant something. It said that the Republican Party would fight the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. And the Democratic Party at that time wouldn't touch either one because Stephen Douglas was counting on the Mormons, and he was talking about squatter sovereignty and popular sovereignty. Sorry, no slavery in the territories and no polygamy in the territories or anywhere else. Now, we go from 1856, where the new Republican Party, as one of its birth pangs, has to take a stand against polygamy, meaning the Mormons, meaning Brigham Young and his treasonous secessionist gang out there. They're going to start a civil war in 1857. The Mormon Rebellion, the Mormon War of 1857 to 1858, is the first civil war started inside the United States. The Republican Party was, in a certain sense, formed to prevent this from leading to the disintegration and dissolution of the Union. So now we go from 1856 against polygamy to 2012 nominating the Mormon Romney, whose transition boss and future White House Chief of Staff, because this is the issue, the future White House Chief of Staff under Romney is Mike Leavitt, who supports polygamy. He says polygamy, 1998, polygamy is covered by religious freedom. I'm sorry. Religious freedom includes belief, speech, divine services, whatever, but not overt acts. Once you get to overt acts and actions, then the civil magistrate comes into play. And there you can't say, oh, I killed my wife because of the demands of my religion. There's this funny thing where some British colonial administrator is dealing with some bunch of people, and they say, well, when a woman commits adultery, our custom is that we kill her, we stone her to death. And the British colonial administrator says, yeah, and our custom is if you do that, we hang you. So at that point, no, that all religions have to yield to reason of state. Yes. Henry IV of France knew it. The Duke of Sully knew it, that it is not worth it to have the competing absolute claims of a myriad of religions tear society apart and degenerate into civil war, which is exactly what the Mormons did in the time that they were living in the United States. The competing absolute claims of religion are irreconcilable, and they will lead to civil war unless the civil magistrate, backed up with some power, says no, thus far and no further. Say what you want, print what you want, but once you pick up guns, once you start committing overt acts, then you have to be judged according to the applicable law. So look at this. The wheel has come full circle. The Republicans of 1856 created, they would say, to fight slavery and polygamy, and now we have Mitt Romney with Leavitt. So Leavitt says polygamy is covered by religious freedom. Leavitt is also a guy who covered up for the Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857, 140 Arkansas travelers killed, cynically, cold-blooded, first-degree capital murder, killed by a gang of Mormon Danites. The Danites, of course, are the armed militia and political police of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. So they were cynically murdered. It was blamed on Indians. Indians didn't do anything much at all, but mainly Mormons. And it turns out that Mike Leavitt has a namesake, direct linear ancestor, Thomas Dudley Leavitt, often Dudley Leavitt. Dudley Leavitt is part of the killing brigade, the death squad. Let's call it the Mormon death squad, because that's what it was. The death squad that killed those people from Arkansas, just because they were passing through. They were a target of opportunity, but of course, Parley Pratt had recently been killed by an indignant, enraged husband in Arkansas, or from Arkansas, because the Parley Pratt had carried off the guy's wife for his polygamous harem. So he got killed, and that was the reason that the Arkansas group was attractive for Brigham Young to get his death squad going against them. So Mike Leavitt will be the chief of staff in a Romney White House, if it comes to that. So polygamy, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and it's important to point out that Mike Leavitt was the governor of Utah in the middle of the bribery for the Salt Lake City Olympics. Remember, these people are antinomians. They believe that the moral law is suspended for them because they have extra scriptural revelation. It's not so much that they have it as individuals, but they think that through the prophet who rules in Temple Square in Salt Lake City, they think that guy can pronounce revelations and that supersedes all the law and the prophets and the scriptures, right? Whatever it is. This is a bad idea because this means the Cole Porter doctrine comes into play. Anything goes, the Cole Porter doctrine. So Leavitt was the governor in the middle of the efforts of the Mormons to get the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics of 2002. And what happened was the Salt Lake City Mormons, the saints out there, had been trying for some years to get the Winter Olympics to Salt Lake City. And they got beaten out by some Japanese bidders, and they found that the Japanese bidders had been giving people laptops and gifts, and they were practicing bribery, of course. That's how business is done in much of the world. So the Mormons then said, well, we'll do the same thing. They eventually gave out $1 million in bribes to primarily African officials of the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and to this guy Samaranch, you remember him, and to others, people from Finland, people from all over the world, center of gravity, the poorer countries, Africa. And they did it in the form of tuition rebates and tuition assistance, right? If you were on the IOC, they'd say, hey, you want to get your kid educated in the U.S. and Americanized for free? Send them to Brigham Young University. Just vote for us when the voting occurs for the Winter Olympics. $1 million. So, unfortunately, common as this is in the world, here we have that pesky Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This is a federal crime to pay bribes of this type. So a lot of people were about to go to jail. Now, there were two guys up front, Johnson and some other guy, both leading saints, needless to say. They had paid a lot of the bribes, but that was just the beginning. It went up, up, up. It went all the way up to the top, but immediately it went to Governor Leavitt. Romney covered up for Leavitt. Romney saved Leavitt. That's the story of what he did for the Olympic Games. He covered up. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Bear with us. The Bishop Romney's family tradition may be available by the time you hear this, or it may not be. Just keep checking. Should be checking every day or two anyway. Books always take longer than planned, and that's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. Writing these things is a time-consuming process. So we're looking at the first day of the Republican Convention. In 1856, they were against polygamy, and now they've got a Mormon as their candidate. It's the first time in American history that you have a major party candidate who's not a Christian, not a Protestant, not a Christian at all, but this other thing, this separate religion and indeed separate nation. And it's not just a separate nation, one of many, but it's an anti-American one. And you can see that in the statements by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Joseph Smith, at one point in July 4th, 1838, Joseph Smith says, if they don't leave us alone, we're going to turn the United States into an ocean of blood, a pool of gore all across the United States, and it's going to be choose between Joseph Smith and the sword, says this guy. Yeah, in other words, bow down and worship me as the prophet of God, or I'll kill you. That was the platform of the Mormons on July 4th, 1838. Naturally, this then leads to a backlash, which I'm against, right? Mobs, that's a good way to rouse a mob against you. Imagine if somebody came out with this today, right? Romney, or we're going to kill you. Well, they don't go quite that far, do they? So the other thing is the obvious question of racism in this entire thing, right? That based on the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith said, because black people are the descendants of Ham, a biblical character who is thought to be black or non-white, because you're descendants of Ham, you can't come into the priesthood. Now, the priesthood doesn't mean the priesthood in the way that you think. For a Mormon, the priesthood is something that you're going to become when you're 16 or 17 years of age. It's like confirmation, huh? Not a big thing. After that, you become an elder, and after that, you can become something else. So what Joseph Smith is saying is, if you can't get into the priesthood, the Aaronic lower level priesthood, then you can't get anywhere, right? You're essentially left at the kiddie table. But that's what he did. This was an itinerant vendor of papyri he had some mummies, and he was charging admission to see the mummies. So this guy with the papyri sold Joseph Smith one of them. It's basically instructions on how to do embalming with a picture of Osiris. And Joseph Smith said, all right, I'll use this to do a completely fraudulent translation. It's not a translation. It's essentially a series of pronouncements made in the presence of this papyrus, which he couldn't read. The reading of the hieroglyphics depended, of course, on the Rosetta Stone. When the French invaded Egypt in around 1800, the French army found this stone which had the same inscription in three languages, and the two that were relevant were the hieroglyphics and the Greek. And once you had the Greek text, you could then figure out what the hieroglyphics meant, and the Rosetta Stone is then the key to understanding, to deciphering the hieroglyphics. Joseph Smith didn't have this. He could have, I suppose. This is about 1832 or so. But he didn't. He winged it. He made it all up. And then he included in it this thing that the blacks are banned from being priests. Now, what does that mean? He did it. Why did he do it? Originally, this in the first few years of Mormonism, this was not applicable. But this is pure opportunism, pure expediency, dressed up as a religious revelation. In other words, a fraud, because he found, on the one hand, the Mormon Church was expanding into the southern states, and of course, the main thing was that they wanted, the upper classes wanted to keep slavery, so he wanted to appeal to them, and also he wanted to prevent a large influx of free blacks in the northern states. So this was a purely expeditious, pragmatic political swindle by Joseph Smith, dressed up, of course, as a revelation of God. So what do we have today? Romney spent 30 years in an explicitly racist church from his birth in, 1947 until 1978. The first 3 decades of his life, all of his formative years, his education, and everything else, he was selling a religion based on explicit racism. And it also meant, as Fawn Brody and others have pointed out, that reactionaries went to the Mormon Church. In other words, if you were a Baptist and your congregation became integrated or whatever else you were, you could say, I can't have this, I'm a racist, I'm going to go to the local LDS, because there I know for sure that it'll be a lily white congregation, which is what I want. So he waited. He would have stayed there the whole time. In other words, he never left. He stayed, despite the fact that it was a racist and therefore reactionary church. So what do we have today? Voter suppression. In other words, the Republican Party of Mitt Romney now says black people will not be allowed to vote. If you're old, if you're poor, if you're illiterate, whatever you are, you don't have the money or the time, you're working 3 jobs, you don't have time to go and get this document, they're going to take your vote away. So a massive Jim Crow, racist voter suppression offensive. Then you've got the war on women. It's clear there is a war on women. The whole question of interfering with settled law, right? Roe v. Wade, whatever you think of it, is settled law. All of these Supreme Court clowns at their recent confirmation hearings, all of them say, stare decisis, Roe v. Wade is settled law. The Republicans say, no, we are the crazed, reactionary, petty bourgeoisie. We're going to fight that. So voter suppression and the war on women. And is it a coincidence that this happens when the top of the ticket is this figure who comes from a church, from a religious tradition that he says he loves and he reveres, and it's polygamy and the racist exclusion of anybody black? So that is no good. Now, what do we have? A parade of reactionaries, because this was the point at the beginning. The Republican Party organizes the crazed, crisis-stricken, petty bourgeoisie, small towns, rural America, small, low-wage, sweatshop employers. It organizes them for the purpose of Wall Street. Now, you can't do that by saying, you guys should support Wall Street. What you've got to do is use demagogy, racism, war on women, all the rest. So who do we have? Chris Christie, the keynote speaker, the New Jersey answer to Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarschall, a fat fascist, a thug. His contempt for the voters is so obvious. He says, I don't want to be loved, I want to be respected. Who said this before, right? This is, I believe, Caligula, right? Oderint dum metuant. Let them hate me as long as they fear me. Now, of course, this comes from the famous Roman Latin tragedy Accius. Is the author, and it's called the Atreus. And one of the characters in there keeps saying, Oderint dum metuant. Let them hate me as long as they fear me. This is also, I believe, the slogan of the Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl. Other neocons cite this. So that's really what Christie's speech was all about. Oderint dum metuant. Let them hate me as long as they fear me. Well, that's not very promising for governing a country. So that's Chris Christie. Also, it's a tissue of platitudes. If sometimes you'll find fascists who are, clever. Gabriele D'Annunzio, was literarily he had some ideas, but no, Chris Christie is a tissue of banal fascist platitudes, and he's a thug, he's a goon, and he's coming after you. All right, Ted Cruz, the Ivy League version of Shaktian or fascist economics. Right, Ted Cruz. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. And here, once a week, we'll give you the necessary overview to at least begin productive political activity. Attempts are being made to organize an anti-austerity convention, an anti-party convention, anti-austerity convention, anti-establishment convention for New York City, perhaps in October, perhaps even in November. And that will, I think, be an organizing event. It will not simply be a bunch of speeches, hopefully, but it will be actual floor debate. What you don't see at these idiotic conventions, hopefully will go on. So stay tuned to that. So who did we have? Chris Christie, the Garden State Goering, Ted Cruz, the Ivy League Shaktian, Arthur Davis. Oh, my God, Arthur Davis, one of the more regrettable Southern Democrats. And let's say he's an individual of ineffable corruption, and apparently he's had a falling out with Obama that used to be his friend. Mia Love, the black woman mayor of Salt Lake City. Well, you can see what's going on there. That's tokenism. That is tokenism writ large. That's camouflage for the racist tradition that I'm talking about. Nikki Haley, the reactionary of, I believe, Indian origin, now governing down there in the cradle of secessionism. Ann Romney, who expects you to be enthusiastic about her plutocratic family. And this is, of course, the woman who wanted your sympathy because it's such a hard job being the mother of 5 sons. And, of course, the 25 servants in the house, the upstairs maid, the downstairs maid, the cook, the butler, the chauffeur, the gardener, and on and on. Most people can't understand it. It's estimated that her interest in these dressage horses, right, Rafalka, the one that she had at the Olympics, That's $250,000. That's $250,000 worth of horses, and then the stabling, the feeding, and the care, and the vet is probably another $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per year. So you want to have that hobby. Your first year is going to cost you $300,000. Now, what about? There are probably a lot of people who could benefit from horses. There are probably a lot of poor inner city kids who have these diseases, but they're not going to get them. They don't have them now, and they're not going to get them under a Romney administration. So here it is, the naked greed of the parasite. And again, that's the purpose. It's the goal of this is to dupe the crazed reactionary petty bourgeoisie into joining the political faction of their own worst enemies, because people like Ann Romney have been ripping off the petty bourgeoisie, the low-wage sweatshop, small business people, because of the way the tax laws work, right? The tax laws favor who? They favored carried interest and capital gains, and that means Romney and Ann and Bain. Bain, by the way, emerges more and more as, if not a tentacle of the Mormons, perhaps a client, right? That the Mormon accounts were really important. We had that thing in the Washington Post a little while ago about how there are a number of partners at Bain who were Mormons, and when the Mormons needed advice, they would turn to Bain. So there's a whole story of influence peddling. In other words, it's Freemasonic. It's a kind of a faction where every member is going to promote the career of every other member compared to everybody else. And it's very interesting. The literary critic Harold Bloom at Yale, writing about religion in the U.S., he pointed out some years ago the Mormons are actually growing pretty fast. What would happen if we reached a point where Mormons had become a voting bloc that would be indispensable for a presidential candidate? In other words, if they became an absolutely crucial swing factor in U.S. elections, would that be good or bad? I don't think that would be good. And I'm sorry, this stuff about polygamy and racism, that doesn't go away so soon, because you have to realize until 35 years ago, those were the criteria, in the case of the racist part, those are the criteria that determined who became a member of this. And their reactionary stuff is clear. In 1968, the prophet at the head of the church wrote letters to all of the Mormon members of Congress saying, you should vote against the repeal of the Taft-Hartley law, the union-busting measures. In other words, in effect, the guy was saying, we want you to continue to support the union-busting in the Taft-Hartley law. We want to be able to declare Utah a right-to-work state. No unions in Utah. Bust all the unions if they try to come in. So it's not just these ethnic and women's issues, but it's emphatically that these are reactionaries. We'll talk about some of this in just a minute. So that's the lineup. Christie, Ted Cruz, Arthur Davis. Mia Love is of course the Mormon, a black Mormon, right? An anomaly, obviously groomed, right? At the same time that Zbigniew Brzezinski was grooming Obama, it looks like Mia Love was being groomed, or perhaps later. So that's the lineup. And what's the goal of this entire thing? To make fascist economics seem presentable. To make fascist genocidal economics, this direct frontal attack, a killer attack on the American people, to make that presentable, mainstream, that you're not going to get laughed out of the room. You're not going to be called a lunatic and a crackpot, which they are, and you're not going to be called a Hitlerian fascist or Totenkopf SS or whatever the term would be. And this is where these prostitutes come in. The media whores can understand the women's issues and they can understand the race issue. But when it comes to the direct genocidal austerity attack on the American people, the prostitutes think that's fine. David Gregory of Meet the Press, he wants to be tough on the candidates. He wants to hold them to the need for austerity, the need to destroy entitlements, the need to attack the New Deal, New Frontier, and Great Society economic reforms. This is the center of the entire thing. To make fascist austerity economics, Shaktian economics presentable. The psychosis of austerity psychosis, or Abbauwahn, the urge to dismantle the society in order to get rid of the original sin of deficits and debt. Well, no. And anybody who goes through the day thinking that deficits and debt are their main problem, you're crazy. Your living standard is your problem. Full employment is a real problem. There's an ad out with Bill Clinton talking about full employment. Well, he never got to full employment. Full employment has been redefined by these economic charlatans, quackademics. Full employment means full employment. It means that you have virtually no unemployed, and when you buy the newspaper, there are 30 to 50 pages of ads where they're trying to get people to come and take the jobs that they have to offer. That is what it was like in Germany in the late 1960s. You could go over there, or even early 70s. The open jobs, right? Jobs that were going begging, in a sense, were full in the newspaper. Now, how did this happen? We have to talk about Ron Paul. I'm sorry. $1 trillion of genocidal austerity cuts in 1 year was the most extreme position. That was sort of the shockwave generator, and all the other Republicans could then advance in the wake of Ron Paul and seem like Ryan to be more reasonable, less extreme, and so forth. So over this past weekend, we had what may well be Ron Paul's last hurrah, and it was at the Sun Dome down there in Florida. Ron Paul's swan song and last hurrah. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Welcome to our second hour here on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. Now, we're just getting to the point to talk about Ron Paul's farewell, Ron Paul's last hurrah, Ron Paul's swan song with the Sun Dome. Now, the main thing to understand about this is he led these people into the wilderness, and now he's dumping them. He led you into the desert, and now he's saying, ciao, hasta la vista. And that's it. No fighting perspective. What to do? Oh, just keep on keeping on. Platitudes, right? His problem is that his gamble didn't work. The goal of all this was to get little Rand on the national ticket for vice president. That was a bridge too far. The way that it could have worked would have been if Mitt Romney had fallen short. At that point, Mitt Romney would have been able to turn to Ron Paul and say, Ron, get your delegates to vote for me, and I will put little Rand on the ticket. Or at the very least, I'll make him something important. I don't know what. What does he want to be? Secretary of the Treasury? I don't know what. Head of the Federal Reserve? Probably vice president. That's the most plausible. But it didn't work because the other candidates were too weak, and the Ron Paul help worked so well, right? Ron Paul helped Mitt Romney win Michigan. If Romney had lost Michigan, considered one of his home states, he would have been almost fatally weakened. And the effect of the Ron Paul candidacy was to siphon off the votes from Santorum that Santorum would have used to defeat Romney. So, in a certain sense, what Ron Paul did for Romney during the primaries worked excessively well. He helped him in terms of siphoning away the votes, and of course he ran interference for him in all of the debates. So they didn't need Ron Paul and his delegates. Those delegates would have been the kings of the world. They would have been feted in all the hospitality suites. They would have been the apple of Romney's eye. But he didn't need them, so now he casts them out, right? He says, you guys, drop dead, get out of here. And, well, we've seen now how the Ron Paul delegates were mistreated, right? I mean, this is a totalitarian party. Surprise, it's a totalitarian fascistoid party, because when you're organizing the crazed petty bourgeoisie for the purposes of finance capital and Wall Street, you can't have too much of this grassroots stuff. Now, if you think Ted Cruz is the grassroots, the Tea Party from Princeton, yeah, that's extremely plausible. These have all been taken over by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, the Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers networks, and so forth. Right? That's what's left of the Tea Party. These are a bunch of political opportunists on the make who have attached the label Tea Party and the funding to themselves. And, of course, they go through a litany of extreme reactionary fascistoid positions. But, that left Ron Paul not needed. So you saw it when they had the roll call of the states. I can remember in 1968 up in upstate New York with a couple of fellow students, we were listening to the Republican convention of 1968, the roll call between Nelson Rockefeller and Nixon to see how that would turn out. And Nixon, of course, won. Now, of course, this is all over. But in this case, the totalitarian Republicans don't even count the votes, right? The state delegation would say, Texas, 20 for Ron Paul and 50 for Romney, or whatever it was. And they'd say, Romney, 50, and that was it. You didn't exist. That's a totalitarian party. And these poor Ron Paul people, these poor duped gulls who sweated blood for this and who believed in it. How could you? I told you not to do this. You were duped. You were used. And now, of course, we even have this rule change. They changed the rules. It's not enough to get 6 states with a petition. Now you got to have 8 states, and they made that change right on the floor. This is essentially the Nuremberg rally. It's got as much relation to law as the Nuremberg rallies back in the 1930s. It's a show, right? It's getting to be more and more like a Nuremberg rally and less like a political party convention on the 19th or early or even mid 20th century model. So I urge you, Ron Paul people, learn this lesson, for God's sake. Get out of the Republican Party. Dump that group of reactionary swine. Don't be mixed in with those fascistoid creeps. Get out. Dump them. What more do you need? They've given you an engraved invitation. You are spat upon. You are scorned. You are ridiculed. Get out of there. Get into some kind of an existential crisis and ask yourself, what the hell are you doing? And dump that Austrian ideology, because the reason that you got into this predicament, think of it, in the first election after Mad Dog Bush the Younger and Cheney leave the White House, you're back in the Republican Party. Who did that? Ron Paul, the leprechaun. He used his pixie dust to turn you into Republicans. You should have taken an oath, as I did, when that Bush-Cheney ticket left the White House, never to support a Republican for 5,000 years. And instead, within just a few years, Ron Paul had sucked you in. And remember, that whole exercise was to put little Rand on the ticket. That's horrendous. So now learn the lesson. Get out of the Republican Party. Consider doing what I tell you, which is fight austerity. Don't you be the shock troops of ruling class austerity. Don't you be the squadristi out there for the Simpson Bowles or the Republican Study Group or any of the other competing models of how to flay the American people alive. You want to be populists, defend the people. Defend the economic rights of the people, not deficits, debt, and all this idiotic garbage. Put away Milton Friedman. Toss that stuff into the garbage can. Von Hayek, von Mises, they're all paid by Rockefeller. They're all Rockefeller agents. Every one of them paid by Rockefeller, promoted by Rockefeller. Learn something. So that's the Republicans. Now, a couple of more things on Ron Paul's speech. What does he have in there? The Anti-Corn Law League he's got. He says, wasn't it great when the corn laws were repealed? Well, thank goodness we have the American system of political economy. And there we have Friedrich List, the great railroad builder of Central Europe and the great defender of the American system against British free trade. British free trade is the enemy system. It is the hostile system. It was designed to destroy the United States, and by God, it's working. And Ron Paul is the exterminating angel that brings it to you. And also, with this, you get yourself into the same boat with Karl Marx. So the Anti-Corn Law League. On Bretton Woods, he attacks Bretton Woods. He says there are some people who want to go back to Bretton Woods. You're right, Ron. I'm one of them. I want to go back to Bretton Woods, with obviously the changes that historical experience shows. Bretton Woods was simply this. It was the New Deal for the world, and as such, between 1944 and 1971, we had the highest rates of economic growth, employment, rising living standards, the best economic record in world history, before or since. And that's not good enough, because it violates the Austrian school. I want to see the success stories of von Hayek, von Mises, and these other bums, these other stalking horses for fascism. Because remember, that's what they did in Germany. The Bruning economic policies were learned at the London School of Economics, dominated by von Mises and von Hayek and Lionel Robbins. That's what he put into action. That opened the door for Hitlerism. So, yeah, we do want to go back to Bretton Woods. A couple of other things on Ron Paul's farewell speech in a minute. So, Friedrich List, yes. Karl Marx, no. Ron Paul, no. No Austrian school needed. The American system of political economy rules, not the Austrian one. And the American system is, of course, through Friedrich List, basically identical with the 19th century German school, which is the one that the Austrians are fighting most directly. So Ron Paul thinks that British free trade, as expressed by the Cobden and Bright Anti-Corn Law League and Marx, is the great thing, that Bretton Woods was a bad thing, quite the opposite. When they say risk, the biggest risk in the world is currency risk, and half of the derivatives or more are due to currency risk. So if we want to get rid of derivatives, one of the things we can do is remove the risk, re-regulate the international currency markets. And there's even, as a kind of a consolation prize, dulcis in fundum, there's a role for gold in international settlements. But it's not a gold coin standard of this primitive type that they have in mind. Ron Paul supports Assange. He's willing to support that fraud of the intelligence community. And again, he thinks that fascism is exclusively a matter of structure. We started this before. Fascism, the fascist corporate state, is indeed a state-sponsored, government-sponsored, compulsory cartel, but it has to be for a purpose. And the purpose of fascist state-sponsored compulsory cartels is to drive down wages, drive down production, and prop up fake speculative paper, capitalist property titles, as we say. So that's fascism. Now, you can certainly have cooperation. The U.S. defense effort of World War II is government, labor, and the private sector together, where the private sector didn't want to be at that time, but forced to go together because of the war emergency, for the purpose of increasing wages, increasing production, and no reference to property titles or speculative paper of any kind. So the exclusively formalistic definition of fascism is totally unsatisfactory. And above all, what's he trying to get away from? The content of fascism is union busting. The destruction of unions, when you have Mussolini destroying the unions and Hitler destroying the unions, that's the beginning of fascism. And that, of course, is too close for comfort for Ron Paul, because guess what? Ron and Rand both want to destroy all unions with their national right-to-work law, right? They say they're for states' rights, but not when it comes to your state's right to have a union. No. They're complete hypocrites. And the other thing, of course, is killer austerity. Fascism means once you've destroyed the unions, you do that for a reason, so that you can impose killer genocidal austerity, minus 30 to 40% in both the Italian fascist and German Nazi cases. Well, don't look now, but that would also be the effect of the Austrianism on the U.S. economy. So that's all of this. So what we've had is this orgy of Chamber of Commerce rhetoric. It's an ugly face. It's a sickening perspective for the future of this country. All right, and remember, the thing that we want to focus on, I urge people, get busy on Twitter, Mike Leavitt, Leavitt. Mike Leavitt is now the transition boss for Romney. He will be the White House chief of staff, according to insider reports. 3 things about him to start with. In 1998, this guy Leavitt said polygamy is covered by freedom of religion, and he did that to cover up for polygamists. There's a big concentration of polygamists in the southern part of Utah along the Arizona border, right down there. Then the other point is he's got an ancestor in the Mountain Meadows massacre, and they were going to do an anniversary. They were building a monument for the anniversary of the Mountain Meadows massacre. They found unburied human remains at the site after all these years. Under Utah law, that meant forensic studies had to be done. The forensic studies were showing that the vast majority, the quasi-totality of these people had been shot with firearms. The poor Paiute Indians, destitute, impoverished tribe there in Utah in 1857, they didn't have any guns to speak of, 1 or 2 guns for the whole party, the whole camp that was nearby. So it meant that the Mormons had killed women, children, babies with firearms. So once this became obvious, Leavitt said, oh, this is terrible for the families. The poor families, they need closure. He ordered that all of the remains be buried. The forensics had to stop. The remains had to be buried. He violated state law. He interfered with a criminal investigation for murder in order to cover up for the Mormons in general and also for his ancestor back there. And then, third point, the corruption at the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics 2002. Mike Leavitt was implicated heavily in this $1 million of bribes paid out to Third World and other representatives on the International Olympic Committee. And what the dirty work that Mitt Romney did was saving the Olympics. What does it mean he saved the Olympics? He saved Mike Leavitt, and he saved the top poobahs and bigwigs of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Saints, antinomian as always, right? The people who say that the moral law does not apply because they're the saints, right? It's all been suspended. You have this in Christianity, my God. The Quakers are a good example, the early Quakers, or even later. The Quakers say, I have extra scriptural revelation. The moral law may say thou shalt not kill, but I just got a message from God saying that doesn't apply to me. In Judaism, you have it, right? Sabbatai Zvi, Shabtai Zevi. In 1666, he said, look, I'm the new Messiah. I am the Messiah, said he, and therefore the moral law is suspended. So antinomianism, the idea that the moral law, that the rules, the 10 Commandments no longer apply, once you hear that, run. Never trust an antinomian. And I'm afraid the tradition that Mitt Romney says he loves is an antinomian, anti-law tradition, that there is no law. And they did it in action. I can remember at the time of the impeachment of Clinton in 1999, we had Orrin Hatch, who was probably implicated in this stuff himself, right? $1 million of bribes. Orrin Hatch, big defender of polygamy, Mormon senator from Utah. Orrin Hatch came out and he started mouthing off about how corrupt Clinton was. And, of course, the obvious thing was, you, from what pulpit are you speaking there, out there with your Mormon saints? And they were up to their necks in this disgusting bribery exercise. But again, the thing that's, $1 million of bribes, right? This is not going to wrench us out of our chairs. But the hypocrisy, right? The holier-than-thou parade. This is what got you with Orrin Hatch. All right, back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So that's the Republican convention. Now, in addition to Mike Leavitt, we want to pay special attention to Mike Leavitt. There's obviously a vulnerability of this whole Romney operation. He's got one guy that's got polygamy and Mountain Meadows massacre and corruption and antinomianism written all over him, and that happens to be the key guy of his entire operation. Mike Leavitt, former governor of Utah, sixth-generation Mormon, whatever he is, beneficiary of this entire system, right? And the guy's he's widely accused of also having been corrupt this was a key part of the Bush electoral machine. Remember, the Latter-day Saints of Utah were absolutely critical to getting Bush-Cheney elected through many, many things. Bush made a pilgrimage to meet with the first presidency of the Mormon Church. This was not widely noticed, at least by me at the time. In 2006, Bush went to Salt Lake City, and he was received by the first president and his 2 or 3 counselors. Right? These are old, white types. Bush went to them. Right? So this was sort of his way of saying thank you, because they had played such a key role in his career. Anyway, by the time Levitt was Bush's Secretary of Health and Human Services, he was widely attacked for corruption because he had his own consulting firm and business interest on the outside at the same time that he was there in the government. So all kinds of stuff with Mike Levitt, right? To begin, pull some of these threads. Get busy, people. It's time to do this, because nobody else will do this, by the way. All right. The last time, well, not the last time, but certainly the last time that a Mormon got the nomination was Joseph Smith, and of course he nominated himself. Right? He was the nominee of the Latter-day Saints party. Actually, it's more complicated. In 1843, thereabouts, we have the Mormons creating something called the Council of 50. The Council of 50. And this is the political arm. The Mormon Church has the Quorum of the 12. They have the first presidency. They have other Freemasonic-style committees. But the Council of 50 is the one that interests us the most, because this is what nominated Joseph Smith for President of the United States in 1854. Here we are. In April of 1844, the Council of 50 is created, and their task is to overthrow this nation. Quote, overthrow this nation. In other words, to destroy the United States. Now, this is before Joseph Smith got killed. The Mormons certainly had been treated badly, obviously outrageous, illegal treatment by the border ruffians, the secessionists and slave drivers of Missouri. But in March, April of 1844, he created the Council of 50, radically different from all of the other governing bodies of the Mormon Church, because it has non-Mormons in it, 2 or 3 non-Mormons, but still, it's not a church organization, but it's above, in certain way. It's the political direction of the entire project. Now, they say that the Council of 50 became extinct when Heber Grant, first president, died. He was the last one who had been member of the Council of 50, but I don't believe that. I think there still is a Council of 50, and Mike Levitt is undoubtedly part of it, and so is Romney, and you want to look for Marriott and Huntsman and these other people as being part of it. So April 11th, 1844, in the midst of democratic America, studied by de Tocqueville and all the rest, the Council of 50 declared Joseph Smith King of the Kingdom of God. So remember, he's the mayor of Nauvoo. He's the head of the city council of Nauvoo. He's the chief judge of Nauvoo. He's the head of the militia. He's actually lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, the Mormon militia. It means that he has a higher rank than anybody in the U.S. Army. Major general was the highest for them at the time, but he gets declared king of the kingdom of God. In the midst of Jacksonian, post-Jacksonian democracy, not so good. Not so good. Let's see. So he wants to be a sacral king, not even a secularized, right? By the time you get, to Louis Philippe, let's say, Louis Philippe of France, 1830 to 1848, wears trousers, doesn't, he downplays the sacral aspect. But the king who's also a priest, or Caesaropapism, where the emperor and the pope are the same person, the Byzantine system. this is what Joseph Smith has in mind. And helpfully enough, we have Parley Parker Pratt, Mitt Romney's great-great-grandfather, the third-ranking top Mormon of the first 30 years of this operation. He says, Parley Pratt, April 1844, the Council of 50 represents, quote, the most exalted council with which our earth is at present dignified. Now that means, you guessed it, one world government, the new world order, one world government, there it is. Now later on, Cleon Skousen of the Mormon FBI faction comes along and starts talking about the new world order and harassing Carroll Quigley and copying large parts of his work. But really, you don't have to look so far. You don't have to look at Rockefeller for the New World Order. You can get it through Parley Pratt. Joseph Smith declared his candidacy for president in the spring of 1844. One of the quorum of the 12 is a guy called Lyman White. And he says, Joseph, what are you running for president for? You're already president pro tem of the world. So the Council of 50 is supposed to set up the kingdom of God on earth. And the way that most people have heard of this lately is, what do the Wahhabites say? The Wahhabites of Saudi Arabia and therefore Al-Qaeda say no government in the Muslim Islamic world, Arab world, is legitimate because it's not the caliphate. It has to be the caliphate. If it's not the caliphate, no good. That's really the same thing these Mormons are arguing from the Christian point of view. They're saying if it's not the kingdom of God, if it's not the empire of God on earth, Christ on earth, then it's no good, and we'll oppose it. And again, that's a recipe for civil war. Remember my old friend Ali Mazaheri of Iran, died 20 years ago now, but he pointed out the miracles of the Victorian age, Karl Marx, the Bab, the founder of Baha'i, and Joseph Smith. I would add the celestial kingdom of the Taiping in China is very, very similar. In the case of Joseph Smith, he's practically saying he's the descendant of Jesus Christ, he's the replacement, he's the continuation of Christ. He can become a god. He can advance to the level of godhood. And that's really what Hung, the head of the Taiping, said, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and therefore this started this huge rebellion. In other words, you can get huge civil wars out of these theocracies that all start with this idea that the absolutist claims, the apocalyptic absolute claims of a faith in the sectarian manner, that these have to take precedence over the law and over the peace of society. And therefore, the British obviously promoted them. And we'll talk, we have talked and we'll talk more about how the British church interest in all this is quite obvious. And we've talked about the support coming from Thomas Carlyle, top Victorian man of letters, and John Stuart Mill, both supporting the Mormons, Dickens supporting the Mormons, some others later on not supporting them so much, but at this point they're getting full support. So, the Council of 50 and Joseph Smith for President, 1844. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So let's continue with this. Right now it's 2012, Mitt Romney for President. 1844, in the springtime, it's Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, for President, right? One of the most successful charlatans of modern times, in the sense of building something with very little, right? Very resourceful, very cunning, but not good as a model of government. Going to end up in a tremendous conflict and unable to learn from the conflicts that he had along the way. The Council of 50 is supposed to be the preparation for the kingdom of God on earth. As a matter of fact, the Council of 50 is what, under the White Horse prophecy, when the Constitution hangs by a thread, the Council of 50 is going to take over the United States government, and then it's going to conquer the world. And the last struggle will be against Russia. The Council of 50 will take over the United States, ally with the British and Northern Europe, and destroy China and Russia. That's the White Horse prophecy of 1844, in the middle of this. But let's look at this kingdom of God. Now, We talked about Parley Pratt. That's Romney's great-great-grandfather. How about Orson Pratt, his great-great-great-great-uncle, brother of Parley? The Council of 50, he says, quote, "It is the only legal government that can exist in any part of the universe." This is not just one world government, it's one universe government. "All other governments are illegal and unauthorized," writes this Mormon theorist. "God, having made all beings and worlds, has the supreme right to govern them by his own laws and by officers of his own appointment." Oh my God, hold on to your hat. "Any people attempting to govern themselves by laws of their own making and by officers of their own appointment are in direct rebellion against the kingdom of God. For the past 1,000 years, no true and legal government had existed. All the emperors, kings, princes, presidents, lords, nobles, and rulers during that long night of darkness have acted without authority. Not one of them was called or anointed a king or prince by the Almighty. So for the past 1,000 years, no true and legal government has existed, and they've all acted without authority. Not one of them was called or anointed king by the God of heaven. Not one of them received any communication whatsoever from the rightful sovereign, the great king." So there it is. Joseph Smith then demands that Congress, March 1844, he wants, and the Council of 50, called upon the United States Congress to say, Joseph Smith has got to be made an officer of the United States Army, and he's got to be given the power to call up 100,000 volunteers to secure the U.S. border. Now, 100,000 volunteers, the entire United States Army at this point is fewer than 15,000. So 100,000 armed volunteers. And the argument is they're not regulars, they'll cost you less, you don't need to keep them all the time. The House of Representatives rebuffed him May 25th, 1844. They wouldn't consider it. Now, in 1844, what's the situation? It's Henry Clay for the Whigs and James K. Polk for the Democrats. This is a fateful election. That's what they say about the current one. This really was one. Whether today is or not depends on what happens. The Mormons have this tradition of monolithic block voting. They all vote the same. They do what the leader, Joseph Smith, tells them to do. During the 1830s, they're generally interested in particularism, local control, so they support the Democrats. They support Jackson. They support Van Buren. But Joseph Smith went to see Van Buren after the Mormons were driven out of Missouri by the slave owners, the border ruffians. They had to take refuge in Illinois. Joseph Smith went to Van Buren and said, help us. And Van Buren said, I can't help you. I'd lose the state of Missouri forever. No. So at that point, they turn against Van Buren. When they get to Illinois, Stephen Douglas, the guy who opposes Lincoln in those debates, he gets these crazy charters for the Mormons in Nauvoo that they can have their own private army, that they can be autonomous, they can be self-governing. He basically plays into the hands of this theocracy, right? And it's coherent with his squatter sovereignty. So, but now it's Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay is the embodiment of the American system. He's the one who actually created the term. Henry Clay's program, three things: a national bank to revive the first and second banks of the United States created by Hamilton and others. Without this, economic depression and a slowdown of economic development. Wall Street, the bankers, the Astors, the Girards of Philadelphia, they all run wild if there's no Bank of the United States. There's nothing between you and London. London can attack you anytime if you don't have the Bank of the United States. So recreate it. Secondly, a protective tariff. Industrialize. Thirdly, internal improvements, infrastructure paid for by the federal government if they're of national interest, even if they're only in one state. Who cares where they are? It's the question of what they do for the country. So that would be the Transcontinental Railroad, the canal system, and so forth. So that's Henry Clay. I would say the last chance to avoid the U.S. Civil War breaking out in 1861. The last chance to avoid that is Henry Clay in 1844. You'll remember that Harrison had been elected in 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Looks like he was killed. He died. Yet Tyler, complete saboteur, complete slavocrat, slave power conspiracy type, and that was the attempt. Daniel Webster made an attempt to create the third bank of the United States, but Tyler stopped it. And, of course, Tyler was abandoned by his own cabinet. He was an absolute wrecker and saboteur in office. So now you've had a second chance after the Whig Harrison wins in 1840. Now it's the last chance for the Whig Henry Clay of Kentucky, Mr. American System, National Bank, protective tariff, and infrastructure. With that, you could have sped up economic development, industrialized, the specific gravity of the slave power would have diminished, right? They would have been marginalized. Other economic opportunities, you could have started the industrialization of the South, railroads into the South, canals in the South, build up industry, create a counterweight to the slave drivers so that they wouldn't be the only ruling elite in the southern states. It wasn't done. And one of the reasons is Joseph Smith. So it's between Clay and Polk. Now, Joseph Smith comes forward and he says, I'm in favor of having Texas join the Union, but then I want to have slavery abolished with compensation paid to the owners out of the sale of public lands. He's in favor of a Bank of the United States. So you can see what he's doing. He's taking a middle position between Clay and Polk, but ultimately somewhat closer to Clay. So he wants to siphon the votes away from Clay. And above all, he wants to become the decisive swing factor, right, that he can be the kingmaker. He gets this guy Phelps to write a pamphlet, General Smith's Views on the Power and Policy of the Government of the United States. And he wanted to be called General Smith now, General Joseph Smith. This guy was an uneducated, practically illiterate farmer in 1820 to, I guess, up until 1827 when he finally got the gold plates came around 1827-28 or thereabouts. So he wants to siphon votes away from Clay and make sure that somebody else wins. And again, the reason for this, my thesis, which I think is new, I don't see anybody else having it, that this is what British intelligence wanted. This is what the City of London wanted, the British Court of St. James, and the people that run, people like Edward Irving and the various religious groups that reach out to the Mormons. And, of course, by now the Mormons are majority British, right? The Welsh, the Scots, and the English are more than half of their world membership. So it's a British force. Back in a minute.